Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. We're in a season of the Christian faith, of course, leading up to the Sunday called Easter. And maybe I should start by making the point that Easter is a yearly celebration of the resurrection of Christ, but truly every Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection of Christ because Jesus rose on the first day of the week. So there's always an emphasis on that. If you go back and read what the apostles were preaching about in the book of Acts, that's pretty much what they talked about, that Jesus was who he said he is, and that he had been raised from the dead by God. It's interesting that what they were talking about, the verse that comes to my mind immediately is Romans 10:9. It says, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus, that Jesus is Lord, who he said he was, and that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. So what they were talking about, these two things, that Jesus is who he says he is, and that God raised him from the dead, are the bottom line issues for Christianity. So we're doing programs leading up to the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. The prior program, we talked about the fact that Jesus is a real person. And I guess what I want to emphasize here is that you really don't need the New Testament to know that. I know there are some myth theories out there that people try to make the case that Jesus never really lived, but the overwhelming historical evidence and the overwhelming historians, the overwhelming percentage of historians, nobody doubts really that Jesus is a real first century Jewish rabbi who claimed to be the Messiah of Israel and the Son of God. Those two things bring us to the second point that we talked about on the last program, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And here again, you don't need the New Testament for that. It's great to have the New Testament, but you don't need the New Testament to establish those things. So we're taking smaller bites out of this because we have several weeks leading up to Easter here. So the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, the fact that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, a historical fact you might say, number two. Tonight we want to talk about the empty tomb, and it'll take me a minute or two to get up to that and just show you why, again, the vast majority of historians, Christian or not, agree that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin. That we covered on the last program as well. All the historical evidence points to it. And they concede that the tomb 3 days later was found empty. Let me park there and just back up and make one last point here. When I was in college, I think I've mentioned this before in the program, I took a course on world religions. I was an atheist at the time, but the textbook was written by a guy named Houston Smith, who was considered to be one of the great historians of religion. And he had a chapter on basically the major religions of the world. When he got to the chapter on Christianity, he said something that he did not say about any other religion that he described to us in the book. He said Christianity is basically an historical religion. He didn't say that about any other religions because they're basically not historical religions. They aren't dependent on historical verification. What you have in the New Testament, the genre as it's called, the type of writing it is historical biography. And the New Testament Gospels in particular are just filled with verifiable historical events from the first century. And we did a lot of programs on that season before last. The doctrines of Christianity are housed inside that historical narrative. And so what we want to show tonight is that the overwhelming consensus is that the tomb that Jesus was buried in was found empty. Now I want to say this, the percentage drops. It's interesting that you've got about 95% of all historians across the board that believe that Jesus is a real person who lived in first century Palestine, that he was a Jewish rabbi. About the same percentage agree that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was the Caesar, the emperor of Rome. When you get to this fact that we're talking about tonight, that the tomb was found empty, it's suddenly the percentage of agreement drops by about 20%. So you have about 75% of historical scholars that agree, that's still an overwhelming majority, that the tomb was found empty. Why does it drop? That's the question. And so that's what we want to talk about. Stay with us. It's interesting to me that the percentage of agreement among historical scholars drops just a little bit when we come to the empty tomb, which we want to talk about tonight. And we're just isolating this one historical fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty. William Ward, who is a history professor and historical scholar at Oxford University, says it this way. He says, all of the historical evidence points to the empty tomb, the fact that Jesus was buried in the grave of Joseph of Arimathea, and 3 days later the tomb was found empty. Then he makes this statement: any scholar who rejects the historicity of the empty tomb ought to recognize that he is not rejecting it on the basis of historical science, but on some other grounds. What does he mean by that? What does he mean if it's historically accurate, if you're using historical criteria to show that the empty tomb is accurate, then what other grounds would there be to reject it? Well, what he's talking about here is a big word that I've used before on the program, but here's what I want to show you. They're rejecting it because it requires an explanation that they don't like. In other words, if it's an easy explanation that Jesus lived, even if you don't think he's the Son of God, you can agree that he lived as a man. It's not hard to explain that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That's I think it was a supernatural event, but you could agree that it was at least a natural event. He was executed. When you come to the empty tomb, however, it's still, in a sense, a natural event, but you have to explain how did the tomb get empty, and that's where they sort of balk, because there is no good explanation for it, other than the resurrection, of course, and they reject that out of hand because they're only willing to go with what's called methodological naturalism. In other words, it can't happen. That's their presupposition. So if it can't happen, the tomb must not have been empty, and you've still only got a drop of 20%. So it's amazing to me that with that requirement of explaining the empty tomb, that you've still got 75% of historical scholars who would say, yes, we concede that the tomb was found empty. I think that's extremely important to recognize here, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. On what basis then do these people, certainly not all Christians, some of them would deny the resurrection, but they still concede that the tomb was empty and then try to explain it some other way by natural means. So we want to look at basically three things tonight. I'll tell you what they are, and I think you can probably take these with you and remember it if you watch the program. Number one is, what's the historical criteria here that convinces so many, if they're not committed to naturalism, that Jesus' tomb was empty? The first factor is called the Jerusalem factor, and I'll explain that. Then the second evidence that convinces historians is called enemy attestation, and I'll explain that. And then the third one is the criteria of embarrassment. And all those are just historical methods that ancient historians use to verify the events of ancient history. So the Jerusalem factor, enemy attestation, and the embarrassment, the idea of this is an embarrassing way to present this fact that the tomb was found empty. I want to say another word before we move on about this idea of a prior commitment to naturalism. You know, they might be justified in saying we're only going to consider natural explanations because we know that nobody can rise naturally from the dead. Well, if that's what Christians were claiming, that by some natural means that we don't know about, Jesus rose from the dead by some natural law, that would be understandable, but that's exactly not what anybody that I know of is claiming. They're claiming that Jesus rose again from the dead by supernatural means, that God did it. And that's, of course, goes back to Romans 10:9, if you believe that God raised him from the dead. So it's really, there's no grounds to eliminate that possibility. being a naturalist, of course, is fine. You can say, I'm only looking for natural explanations, but that still doesn't justify the elimination automatically out of hand of any supernatural explanations. So there again, you've got 75%, which is pretty remarkable because, again, you have to explain the empty tomb. Let me give you a couple of why there's so many that weigh in on this. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here from some very well-respected historians. This is a Cambridge historian. His name is A.T. Robertson. Here's what he says. All the historical tests are passed. The burial of Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea and the empty tomb are historical facts. Now that's just an historical scholar using the historical criteria. And by the way, that's from external evidence. I mean, he might consider the evidence of the New Testament, but again, you don't need the New Testament to know Jesus is real. You don't need the New Testament to know that Jesus was crucified. I'm thankful we have it. And really, you almost don't need the New Testament to know that the tomb was found empty because of what happened afterwards. Michael Grant, he's a skeptic, admittedly, and a historian from Edinburgh University. He says this, if we apply the same sort of criteria that we apply to any other literary sources, then the evidence is firm and necessitates the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. So where we're going from here is what kind of evidence, what is this firm evidence that necessitates the conclusion that the tomb was found empty? Well, the first one I said was the Jerusalem factor. So that's the first subject we want to talk about. It's really simple, and I think you'll understand it well. So what do we mean by the Jerusalem factor? Again, you don't need the New Testament to know this. You can get it from Josephus, you can get it, who's a Jewish historian, from Tacitus, a Roman historian, Pliny the Younger, also a Roman historian, Suetonius, also a Roman historian. Plus, it's recorded in all four Gospels, which are still, even if you don't want to believe that it's the Word of God, they're still four independent accounts of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And they all four record this. Here's the point. Jesus was publicly executed in Jerusalem. And again, you don't need the New Testament for that. There's no conflicting testimony from any historian of the period. And think about this now. 40 days later, his apostles publicly were preaching that God had raised him from the dead. It's really a no-brainer. If the tomb were not empty, that preaching would not get off the ground. Now, I want to maintain a few things here. I don't think that the Jews would have displayed his body. Now, that was the obvious way to stop this preaching about the resurrection is to say, look, Jesus is still in the tomb. We'll conduct tours, and you can go by and look inside to see that the body is still there. But the Romans would have had no qualms about it. The Jews would have had qualms about it because by Old Testament law, they would have been defiled if they touched that body or opened the tomb. Now, the key word that I want to keep bringing up here with this Jerusalem factor idea is the word public. Again, it's a public event. The execution, as all crucifixions were meant to be, was a very public event. That's why so many other historians, other than the New Testament historians, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record that Jesus was crucified publicly. The preaching of the apostles 40 days later was also public. So you've got a public preaching about a public event to the same people who live in the same city where this event happened. So again, if the tomb is not empty, that's just not possible. I hope you can just see the import of that. Now, again, the Jews wouldn't have, I don't think would have even, they would have loved to have seen the body displayed, but their law would have prevented them from going back and unsealing the tomb. Just to mention that, tombs in Jerusalem, they're still all over the place there. The tombs are caves, basically, and they would put the body in there, and then they would roll this humongous stone into a ditch, basically, in front of the cave to seal it. And in this case, Matthew reports that there was a Roman guard put in front of it just in case the disciples would try to steal the body. I think the most plausible suspects, as it were, to have stolen the body, as far as would they be willing to, would be the Romans. But they had no motive to. They might have had motive to roll the stone away. Frank Morrison was a skeptic, and I've started thinking of all this long list of skeptics who tried to disprove the resurrection and ended up becoming believers and followers of Christ. Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, Frank Morrison's one of them, and he wrote a book entitled Who Moved the Stone? Now I want to say at the outset at this point that the stone was not rolled away to let Jesus out. That wasn't the point. Jesus wouldn't have needed the stone rolled away for him to get out. He was in a glorified body. He was walking through walls later, so to speak. So I don't think he needed the stone rolled away so he could get out. The stone needed to be rolled away so people could look in and see that the tomb was empty. I have the question, why didn't the Jews get the Romans to put a body in the tomb? Because after all, it was 40 days later. Maybe they could say, well, the body's been decomposed so much that it's unrecognizable, but trust us, that's still Jesus in the tomb, so this resurrection preaching is baloney. There's no record, that didn't happen. The tomb was simply found empty, and that brings us to the third point, or the second point about this, called enemy attestation. The enemies of Christ would have loved, both Jews and Romans. I mean, think about it. Christianity is an illegal religion for 300 years, so it's against the law to be a Christian, certainly to preach Christianity. They would love to have stopped this movement at its very beginning, but it was all public. The empty tomb was public. Anybody could go by and see that the tomb was empty. So why didn't the Romans take a body in there if they had to and say it was Jesus? They could have, but that's exactly not what they did. As a matter of fact, his enemies tried to explain why the tomb was empty. And they said the disciples came and stole the body. Now, Matthew reports that. He's the only gospel writer who reports that that's what happened. But he's not the only historian who does. There are other ancient historians who also say that it's reported that the Jews stole the body. Now, there's a Roman guard around the tomb. So it's implausible to think for 100 reasons or more that the Jewish disciples, Jesus' disciples, had no reason to come and steal the body. I love Luke 24, the narrative there, where you've got two disciples who have left town, and this is after the resurrection, by the way, after the empty tomb, but they haven't seen the resurrected Christ yet. And the disciples had no clue and no idea that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. They didn't know they thought somebody stole the body too. The women thought somebody had stolen the body too. And so these two disciples are leaving Jerusalem, maybe out of fear, maybe out of just discouragement and depression, or all three. And Luke 24 tells us that Jesus meets them on the road, but for one reason or another, I assume that he did not reveal himself to them as to who he was, but he starts talking to them and he says, why are you so disheartened? Why are you so downtrodden? I think their response is remarkable. They said, basically, let me put it in modern vernacular, they said, don't you watch the news? Don't you read the newspaper? Don't you have internet? Are you not aware of the events that have been happening in Jerusalem over these last few days? The man that we thought was the Messiah was crucified. The very people that we thought he was going to overthrow, the Romans, put him to death. It's over. So we're out of here. And then Jesus opens the scriptures and shows to them from the Old Testament, everything he taught was from the Old Testament, how that the Messiah would have to die in order to pay for the sins of the world, pay for the sins of Israel, and not just Israel, but the world. And it says their eyes were opened and they saw this in the scripture, and then they recognized him. The first thing they did was make a beeline back to Jerusalem and tell the disciples that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, and they were really trying to convince them. Well, why were they having to convince these disciples? I mean, the tomb was empty, Jesus had risen from the dead, and the disciples still didn't really believe that. So these two guys went back, and they weren't the apostles, they were 2 other disciples, they went back and said, look, we saw the risen Christ. Now the disciples are starting to think maybe this is true, but it actually took Jesus 40 days. It said he showed himself alive to them over a period of 40 days by many infallible proofs and taught them the kingdom of God. Basically, here's an intensive seminar on the resurrection of Christ and its meaning after 3.5 years of teaching them the Old Testament and the fact that he is the Messiah. And this brings us to the third point that we're talking about. Why didn't the disciples already believe this? It's because of this principle of embarrassment that we talked about. When historians want to verify if something is true that was written in ancient times, they look for statements that are embarrassing to the people writing it. If somebody's going to make up a lie, they're not going to downgrade themselves. They're not going to make their own case look worse. They're going to build it up, of course. If they're making it up, you're going to build it up to, as much as you can. But this third factor here, this embarrassment factor, is, I think, one of the main things that convinces secular historians that the tomb must have been empty and that the gospel accounts even are accurate on the score. And of course, all 4 gospel accounts report that the tomb was found empty. So now we come to the last factor here. And again, all we're talking about is the fact that the tomb was empty. That's an historical fact. We've quoted a couple of historians to that effect. Here's something interesting too. It's amazing to me that nobody mentioned the empty tomb afterwards. I mean, it's not in any of the apostles' preaching. It's not in the first church creed, whereby they memorized the gospel, and that creed, which was used in the churches before the New Testament was written, is actually recorded in 1 Corinthians, where it says that Jesus died according to the Scriptures, that he was raised according to the Scriptures, but it doesn't mention the empty tomb, because obviously if he's raised from the dead, the tomb was empty. It was just a given. It was. Now I guess you can go take tours of Jerusalem and go see where they think the tomb was. But in those days, it wasn't a shrine. They weren't concerned. It was just a matter-of-fact thing that the tomb had to be empty because Jesus had been raised from the dead. But the reason the disciples had such a hard time believing it at the very first was because of the first witnesses that saw the empty tomb and the risen Christ. Those first witnesses were women. Now that, if you're first century Jewish disciple of Jesus, and you want to invent the story that the tomb was empty, so Jesus is risen from the dead, if you want to invent that, the last people in the world that you would want as your first and primary witnesses to that would be women. Why? Because in both Roman and Jewish first century cultures, women's testimony was disregarded virtually completely. Let me read you a couple of things here. The Jewish Talmud makes this statement: any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Not allowed to testify in a Jewish court. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says this: but let not the testimony of women be admitted. And this is going to be offensive, but he says, on account of the boldness and levity of their sex. In other words, basically what Josephus is saying, you can't trust women, they'll say anything. That's remarkable to me. So this is the third and clinching fact here that, and we'll start over, you've got the public testimony, a public event. If the tomb was not empty, people would have known it. Nobody tried to put a body in the tomb. You've got even the enemies of Christ that are telling you why the tomb is empty. They're explaining that. And then you've got the fact that the Gospels themselves use the women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb. That's why, again, 75% of all historical scholars agree the tomb had to be empty. And I want to go back to what my first quote from William Ward, the Oxford historian. He says, if you deny the empty tomb, you're not doing it on historical grounds. You're doing it on some other criteria, which is, this can't happen. Now, what we're going to talk about in the future is what are the explanations? If it's a fact that Jesus lived, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that 3 days later the tomb was found empty, how do you explain that? In the light of the transformation of the disciples, the preaching, public preaching in the same city where this event occurred, how do you account for these things? What is the historical overall explanation? There's only one of two ways to go. Either humans moved the stone, as Frank Morrison would say, or God moved the stone. Either Jesus got out of that tomb somehow by human hands as a dead body, as a corpse, and was hidden someplace. Who would do that? Or God raised him from the dead. So when we come to that, you'll see that that's the reason in this slight drop, 20% drop, because once you can see that the tomb was found empty, then you have to explain it. And there's really no good explanation for it other than Easter Sunday morning. So thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments, and we'll see you again next time.